Okay, so we're still looking through the letters of John. We've reached his third letter, and we're now on verses 9 and 10. And this is what they say. I have written something to the church, but Diotrephes, who likes to put himself first, does not acknowledge our authority. So if I come, I will bring up what he is doing, talking wicked nonsense against us. And not content with that, he refuses to welcome the brothers and also stops those who want to and puts them out of the church. So 2 weeks ago, when we studied the preceding verses of John's letter, we met Gaius, who you may recall was praised for his willingness to open his home to the missionaries who were spreading the gospel of Jesus Christ. And he was credited with being a fellow worker for the truth. Today, in these two verses, 9 and 10, we meet another character called Diotrephes. But this character is the polar opposite of Gaius. And in just two short verses, John manages to describe someone who likes to put himself first, who refuses to surrender to church authority, who slanders other church leaders, who refuses to offer hospitality to the visiting missionaries like Gaius did, and who excommunicates anyone who opposes his leadership. Now, it would be easy to look at this scripture and consider pointing the finger at church leaders. But you may have heard that old adage, when you point at someone, there are three fingers pointing back at you. So as we work through this passage, I want us to think about how it might apply to us. So let's look more closely at the 5 accusations that John is making against Diotrephes. Firstly, he likes to put himself first. If we turn to Matthew chapter 19, verse 30, we learn that many who are first will be last, and the last first. Now, these words of Jesus are considered so important that they're recorded in 3 of the Gospels. It's here in Matthew, it's here in Mark, and again in Luke. Now, it's interesting to note the word many or some. Why will only some of the first be last? Is that fair? Well, I think it's important to remember that God does call some people to be first. If we relate this back to Diotrephes so we can understand what John means by first, we can see that Diotrephes is head of this particular church. Based on John's damning indictment, I think it's fair to assume that he wasn't called by God to lead the church. It's more likely that he was self-appointed. So when we're considering the word first in this context, it means a leadership role. But God does call people to be in leadership in the church. They may be pastor or elder or deacon, leading the Sunday school or a home group, or simply mentoring someone. When God calls someone into leadership, so long as they are obedient to what God has called them to do, they won't be last when it comes to the kingdom of heaven. However, people like Diotrephes, who abuse the role of leader, will be last. Now, of course, it's possible that Diotrephes was called into leadership, but the power corrupted him. The draw of the world came and strangled the life out of him, like the brambles in the parable of the sower. Matthew 13:22. As for what was sown among thorns, this is the one who hears the word, but the cares of the world and the deceitfulness of riches choke the word, and it proves unfruitful. Now, we have a huge responsibility to one another to see when the brambles are invading and to cut them away so that our leaders do not have the word choked out of them. John 15, verse 2, every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away. And every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes, that it may bear more fruit. And then, learning from John's use of the word me in this scripture, we need to be willing to be pruned. Remember the 3 fingers pointing back at you? Or more importantly, remember what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 7, verse 5. You hypocrite, First, take the log out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to take the speck out of your brother's eye. And then moving on to John's second criticism of Diotrephes, he refuses to surrender to church authority. Now, church authority, here's a thorny issue if ever there was one. Now, there are several forms that this can take, and I want us to think about two of them today. Firstly, there's the rogue individual who decides to go around doing things in the name of the church, but without the authority of the church. And secondly, there's the individual who's behaving badly, but refuses to listen to the discipline of the church leaders appointed by God. Of course, as we've already established, not all church leaders are appointed by God. And there is many a story of individuals breaking away from the church and achieving great things for God. Just look at Martin Luther and the Great Reformation. So how do we work out who's wrong and who's right? When is leadership good and when is it bad? Well, let's turn to Matthew 7:15-20. Beware of false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. You'll recognize them by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from thorn bushes or figs from thorn bushes? So every healthy tree bears good fruit, but the diseased tree bears bad fruit. A healthy tree cannot bear bad fruit, nor can a diseased tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus you will recognize them by their fruits. Luke also records this warning from Jesus, and he adds, the good person out of the good treasure of his heart produces good, and the evil person out of his evil treasure produces evil. For out of the abundance of the heart, his mouth speaks. So here we have it. Scripture once again has the answer. Doesn't it always? Look for the fruit. Is what's being said in line with Scripture? Sadly, some people are very quick to try and baffle us with Scripture, twisting it and changing it to suit their own evil desires, just like Satan when tempting Jesus in the wilderness. Luke chapter 4, verses 9-12. And Satan took Jesus to Jerusalem and set him on the pinnacle of the temple and said to him, if you are the Son of God, throw yourself down from here, for it is written, he will command his angels concerning you to guard you. On their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against a stone. And Jesus answered him, it is said, you shall not put the Lord your God to the test. Jesus knew the Scripture, and so was able to counter everything which Satan said with the truth. How well do we know the Scriptures? It's so important for us to know Scripture, as it's our defense against everything that the enemy can throw against us. It's also the way to exposing the rotten fruit of lies and deceit. So when someone fails to fall under church authority, look carefully. Where is the fruit? Is it with the leadership, or is it with the individual going off and doing their own thing? Who is acting in accordance with Scripture? Don't simply believe the person who quotes the most Scripture. It's the person who is using Scripture to reveal the truth who is right, not the one who is using it to deceive. And if someone is refusing to surrender to church authority, take a look at other areas of their life. Do they surrender to authority in general? Do they surrender to the authority in the workplace? Do they surrender to the authority of the government? Is authority an issue in their lives? These are big clues to the who's right and who's wrong debate when it comes to church authority. And once again, let me just remind you of the log and the speck and the three fingers pointing back at you. When we become disgruntled with leadership, we need to consider where we fit into what we've learned so far. Do we struggle with authority? Have we examined the scripture? Have we asked God? And then there's John's third criticism of Diotrephes. He slanders other church leaders. Now, this is generally a weapon of someone in retreat, someone who can smell defeat in the air. In a desperate attempt to win the support of others, they seek to defame the opposition. It's one thing to disagree with a person's words, but it's something else to resort to slandering that person, trying to discredit them so that their testimony loses its power. But I wonder, have we ever been guilty of saying things like, oh, don't listen to them, they're mad. Don't take any notice of them, they're troublemakers. Ignore them, they've got no idea what they're talking about. Or what about the people of Jerusalem back in Acts chapter 2, verses 13 to 15? But others, mocking, said, they are filled with new wine. But Peter, standing with the 11, lifted his voice and addressed them. Men of Judea and all who dwell in Jerusalem, let this be known to you, and give ear to my words. For these people are not drunk, as you suppose, since it is only the 3rd hour of the day. And Peter went on to quote the scriptures, pointing to various prophecies which proved that Jesus is the Messiah. The Jews accused the disciples of being drunk, but Peter proved what they were saying was true by using the scripture. Now, although not in John's list, there is another more subtle weapon used by the person who refuses to surrender to church authority, and that is, instead of slandering the leaders, they pretend they have the full support of the leaders when they don't, pretending that they represent the leadership when they don't. Here, the general biblical rule of the testimony of two people is a very useful tool in exposing this sort of deceit. And then John's fourth criticism of Diotrephes. He refuses to offer hospitality to the visiting missionaries, like Gaius did. I think it'd be helpful here if we took a wider view of what Gaius did. In offering his home to the missionaries, he was enabling them to carry out the mission. So when we think about being like Gaius, it's not just about opening our homes, it's about enabling mission. 2 weeks ago, when we considered mission, we thought about 3 components. There was going, giving, and praying. And we were able to see how all 3 were fellow workers for the truth. Whilst those who go are physically going on the mission, those who give and those who pray are enabling the mission. You know, there are so many ways in which we can enable mission. For Gaius, it was offering hospitality. For us, in addition to giving and praying, it might be any number of things. Offering friendship to the lonely, doing shopping for the housebound, helping people with mind-boggling paperwork and form filling. How about painting the manse? The list is endless. But if we refuse to do these things, then we are condemned along with Diotrephes. Once again, our fruit reveals our heart. And at this point, I find myself drawn back yet again to James when he said, "What good is it, my brothers, if someone says he has faith but has not works? Can that faith save him? If a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, be warmed and filled,' without giving them the things needed for the body, what good is that? So also, faith by itself, if it does not have works, is dead." Now, I know I'm guilty of repeating this scripture quite a lot, but I do think it's important. It's easy to belittle works when we understand that works cannot save us. It's true, only by the grace of God are we saved. But works are so very, very important. Without them, our faith is dead. And what good is that? So in all you do, consider how you might be fellow workers in the mission. But above all, take care never to refuse to be fellow workers, as Diotrephes did. And John's final point was that Diotrephes excommunicates anyone who opposes his leadership. Now, excommunication may not be something with which many of us are familiar, as despite having scriptural grounding, it's not practiced a great deal. So we can easily just sit back and say, oh, I've never been party to an excommunication. That's just for church leaders, and I'm not on the leadership, so this doesn't have anything to do with me. But wait a minute. There's more than one way of excluding someone from church life. Are there people in our church family who we don't talk to? Are there people in our church family who don't get invited to any social activities? Are there people in our church family whose gifts are going unused? Are there people in our church family who are lonely? Are there people in our church family crying out for help? I think you can see where I'm coming from by now. Excluding anyone from enjoying church life to the full is a form of excommunication. When you're chatting with people about your faith, how often have you heard people say something along the lines of, I don't believe in God. I used to go to church, but someone did this or that to me. If that's what a Christian is like, then I can't believe in God. People judge God by the way that we behave. Now that's a frightening thought. If people think we treat them badly, they will think badly of God. We shouldn't be excluding people from church. We should be welcoming them in such a warm and loving way that they connect with the warmth and love of God. If people judge God by what they see in us, will they be attracted to God or will they reject him? Now, as we enter this exciting new phase of life in OBC, let's call it the cliff era, do we want to be a church who attracts people to God or a church who puts people off God? I think this is our challenge as we move forward. Amen.